He believed he had saved only one frightened maid that rainy afternoon, never imagining that 3 years later the fate of his entire bloodline would rest in her hands. The Calloway estate had never known silence like this. Marble hallways that usually echoed with quiet confidence now held nothing but the distant hum of emergency lights and the frantic footsteps of loyal men searching every room. Family portraits stared down from towering walls as if generations of history were holding their breath. Adrian Calloway stood at the center of the grand foyer with his white dress shirt streaked by dust from shattered glass, his usually unshakable posture weighed down by something he had never allowed anyone to witness before: fear. Not fear for himself, fear for the only family he had left. Somewhere inside the sprawling estate, his 8-year-old son, Oliver, had disappeared in the confusion that had swept through the mansion only minutes earlier. Advisors called his name. Security officers rushed past, carrying radios that crackled with overlapping voices. Every second stretched longer than the last. Adrian ignored every order thrown toward him because his attention remained fixed on one impossible thought. Where was his son? Then, through the haze of confusion, another figure emerged from the east corridor. She moved slowly, one careful step after another, her breathing uneven but her eyes unwavering. Her Navy housekeeping uniform was covered with dust from the old service tunnels beneath the mansion, and loose curls framed her exhausted face. In her arms rested Oliver, asleep against her shoulder as though the chaos surrounding them belonged to another world. The little boy's fingers remained wrapped around the fabric of her sleeve, refusing to let go even in sleep. For one endless heartbeat, no one spoke. Radios fell silent. Conversations stopped halfway through unfinished sentences. Every pair of eyes followed the woman no one had truly noticed for years. Zora Bennett, the black maid who had once quietly polished silverware before sunrise, memorized every hallway without being asked, and disappeared before dinner guests ever learned her name. Adrian stared at her. As disbelief softened into overwhelming relief, Oliver slowly opened his eyes, looked at his father, and whispered with the innocent certainty only a child could possess. She kept her promise. Adrian crossed the marble floor without another word and gathered his son into his arms, but Oliver refused to release Zora's hand until Adrian gently placed his own over both of theirs. Their eyes met for the first time that night, and in the silence between them lived 3 years of memories no one else in the room could possibly understand. 3 years earlier, Zora Bennett had arrived at the Calloway estate carrying nothing more than a small suitcase, a recommendation letter folded neatly inside her purse, and the quiet determination to earn an honest paycheck so her widowed mother could finally receive the medical care she had postponed for far too long. She expected long hours, impossible standards, and the familiar feeling of being invisible. She never expected that before her first week ended, one simple act of kindness from the most powerful man in the city would change both of their lives forever. 3 years earlier, the Calloway estate had looked less like a home and more like a world separated from ordinary life. Iron gates stretched nearly a quarter-mile from the main road, opening onto a winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees whose branches formed a natural arch overhead. Every inch of the property reflected quiet wealth rather than loud extravagance. The limestone mansion overlooked rolling green hills, its wide front steps polished until they reflected the morning sun like glass. Zora Bennett stood outside those towering doors clutching a modest canvas suitcase with both hands. Everything she owned fit inside it. 2 changes of clothes, family photographs, a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and a folded envelope containing unpaid medical bills from the neighborhood clinic back home in Atlanta. Her mother had hidden how sick she had become, insisting everything was fine during every weekly phone call. But hospital records told a different story. Zora had accepted the housekeeping position without hesitation because the salary offered by the Calloway family was nearly double anything she had ever earned. She promised herself that every extra dollar would go directly toward giving her mother another chance at recovery. The head housekeeper, Eleanor Brooks, greeted her with the calm professionalism of someone who had managed impossible expectations for decades. She explained the household rules carefully. Every room had its own schedule. Every object had its proper place. Every employee respected privacy above all else. Questions were discouraged. Gossip was unacceptable. Loyalty mattered more than perfection. Zora listened without interrupting, nodding quietly while memorizing every instruction. She had learned long ago that people often overlooked those who worked with humility, and sometimes being overlooked was the safest place to be. Her first week settled into a predictable rhythm. She woke before sunrise, pressed her uniform until every crease disappeared, and began cleaning long before the family stirred awake. She polished silver until it reflected crystal chandeliers above. She dusted bookshelves filled with first editions she dared not touch longer than necessary. She watered orchids that seemed more expensive than the apartment building where she had grown up. Most members of the household barely noticed her presence. Some guests accepted fresh coffee without making eye contact. Others walked past as though she were another piece of furniture placed conveniently against the wall. None of it surprised her. Invisible people rarely disappointed anyone. Yet she noticed things others ignored. Adrian Calloway always thanked the kitchen staff before leaving for work. He paused every evening outside his son's bedroom, no matter how late he returned home. He never raised his voice with employees, even when problems appeared. The staff respected him not because they feared him, but because his standards never changed depending on who stood before him. That quiet consistency puzzled Zora more than the luxury surrounding her. On Friday evening, the estate prepared for an elegant charity dinner attended by influential guests from across the city. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath warm lights. Classical music floated through the ballroom. Every employee moved with practiced precision as expensive cars filled the circular driveway one after another. Eleanor assigned Zora to serve beverages in the reception hall, reminding her to remain composed no matter what happened. Zora smiled politely, adjusted the white gloves covering her hands, and stepped into a room where one unexpected moment would quietly alter the course of every life connected to the Calloway family. The reception hall shimmered beneath warm golden light as conversations drifted effortlessly between polished marble columns and towering floral arrangements. Waiters moved with practiced precision while a string quartet filled every quiet space with elegant melodies. Zora Bennett balanced a silver tray with steady hands, reminding herself that tonight was no different from any other assignment. Smile politely. Speak only when necessary. Never draw attention to yourself. She offered sparkling water to an elderly couple, then stepped aside as another wave of distinguished guests entered the ballroom, wearing tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. Their laughter carried the easy confidence of people who had never questioned whether they belonged in rooms like this. Zora had learned not to resent that confidence. She simply focused on doing her work well. As she approached a circle of guests near the grand staircase, one woman accepted a glass from the tray before letting her eyes drift slowly over Zora's neatly pressed uniform. The smile on her face looked pleasant enough, yet the words that followed carried an unmistakable edge. "You certainly hired someone who blends into the decor," she said lightly, glancing toward the others. A few guests chuckled politely. Another man swirled the drink in his hand before adding, "I suppose that is the point. Good help should never become noticeable." The group laughed a little louder. Zora lowered her eyes, not because she believed them, but because years of experience had taught her that defending her dignity often made situations worse instead of better. She quietly turned to leave when another guest deliberately stepped into her path. His shoulder brushed the edge of the tray, causing several glasses to wobble dangerously before one tipped over, sending sparkling water across the polished floor and onto the hem of an expensive evening gown. The woman gasped dramatically as though something priceless had been destroyed. Every nearby conversation stopped. Heads turned. The silence that followed felt heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging overhead. Unbelievable. The woman sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Some people simply do not belong in places like this. Another guest shook his head. Perhaps she should return to cleaning empty rooms where mistakes cannot embarrass anyone. Zora immediately reached for a linen napkin. "I am very sorry, ma'am. Please allow me to clean that for you." The woman stepped backward before Zora could help. "Do not touch it. You have already done enough." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the circle. Others looked away, pretending not to notice. Eleanor Brooks started toward them from across the ballroom, concern visible in her eyes, but she was too far away to intervene before another calm voice entered the silence. "She will not apologize for something she did not do." The words were neither loud nor angry, yet every conversation in the room stopped instantly. Adrian Calloway had been speaking with donors near the fireplace only moments earlier. Now he walked toward the gathering with measured steps, adjusting the cuff of his dark suit as though nothing unusual had happened. He looked briefly at the spilled water, then at the guest who had blocked Zora's path. His expression remained composed, but there was unmistakable certainty in his eyes. "I watched the entire exchange," Adrian said evenly. "The accident began when someone chose disrespect over courtesy." No one answered. The man who had stepped into Zora's path suddenly found the marble floor far more interesting than the faces around him. Adrian turned toward Zora with the same calm respect he would have offered any honored guest. "Miss Bennett, thank you for remaining professional under unfair circumstances. Please allow the housekeeping team to handle the floor and enjoy a few minutes to collect yourself." Then he faced the silent crowd once more. "There is one rule that applies equally to every person inside this home. Wealth may earn an invitation. Power may command attention. But neither gives anyone permission to take another person's dignity away." The room remained perfectly still, and for the first time since arriving at the Calloway estate, Zora realized that someone had seen her not as a servant, but simply as a human being worthy of respect. The ballroom slowly returned to its graceful rhythm, but something invisible had changed. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Musicians continued playing, and crystal glasses once again caught the warm light from the chandeliers. Yet many guests found themselves glancing toward the young housekeeper who had quietly disappeared through the service corridor. Zora Bennett paused only long enough to steady her breathing before returning to work. She refused to let tears fall where anyone could see them. Adrian Calloway had restored her dignity with a few calm sentences, but she knew respect was not something to celebrate. It was simply the way every human being should have been treated from the beginning. The following morning, life inside the estate settled back into its familiar routine. Long before sunrise, Zora resumed polishing banisters, arranging fresh flowers, and preparing guest rooms exactly as Eleanor Brooks instructed. Nothing about her routine changed, yet everything felt different. Employees who had once walked past without speaking now greeted her with quiet smiles. The kitchen staff saved a warm breakfast for her after hearing what had happened. Even the gardeners tipped their hats as she crossed the courtyard carrying fresh linens. No one mentioned the ballroom directly, but everyone understood that the owner of the estate had established something more valuable than authority. He had established a standard. Adrian, however, never brought up the incident again. He did not summon Zora to his office. He did not offer dramatic speeches or generous rewards. Instead, he treated her exactly as he treated every honest employee. When they crossed paths in the hallway, he nodded politely and thanked her for her work. That simple consistency impressed Zora more than the public defense itself. She realized his kindness had not been a performance for wealthy guests. It was simply part of the man he chose to be every day. As the weeks passed, she began noticing details that others overlooked. Young Oliver often wandered into the mansion library carrying books much too large for his small hands. He loved old maps, trains, and stories about explorers who crossed oceans without knowing what waited beyond the horizon. Sometimes he sat alone near the enormous bay window, building cities from wooden blocks while adults hurried past with busy schedules. One rainy afternoon, a tower of carefully stacked blocks collapsed across the polished floor. A nearby employee hurried forward to rebuild it exactly as it had been, but Oliver quietly shook his head. Before anyone else could react, Zora knelt beside him. Instead of fixing the tower herself, she smiled gently and asked, "Would you like me to help you build an even stronger one?" The little boy studied her for a moment before returning a shy smile of his own. Together they rebuilt the city, placing each block more carefully than before. From the hallway outside the library, Adrian paused without announcing his presence. He watched his son laugh freely for several minutes, something that had become increasingly rare since the passing of Oliver's mother 2 years earlier. Zora never noticed she was being observed. She simply listened as Oliver proudly explained every bridge, every train station, and every tiny wooden house. Adrian quietly continued down the hallway without interrupting them, but the image remained with him throughout the rest of the day. He had spent years protecting his family with influence, careful planning, and unwavering discipline. Yet watching a lonely child smile again because one patient housekeeper chose compassion over convenience reminded him of something success could never purchase. Sometimes the strongest foundation was not built from stone, wealth, or reputation. Sometimes it began with one person who quietly decided that another human being deserved to feel seen. 3 years passed with remarkable quiet, and the Calloway estate became a place where routines felt almost timeless. Every season left its own gentle signature across the property. Spring filled the gardens with bright colors. Summer carried children's laughter across the wide lawns. Autumn painted the oak trees in deep shades of amber, while winter covered the stone pathways with peaceful blankets of snow. Through every changing season, one thing remained constant. Zora Bennett never forgot the kindness that had restored her dignity on her first week inside the mansion. She repaid it the only way she knew how, not with speeches or grand gestures, but through unwavering loyalty expressed in hundreds of unnoticed moments. She learned every hallway, every hidden staircase, every service entrance, and every maintenance tunnel beneath the estate. She knew which floorboards creaked after midnight, which doors stuck during humid weather, and which windows overlooked the safest routes across the grounds. None of that knowledge seemed important at the time. It simply came from paying attention while everyone else hurried through their busy lives. Oliver grew taller with each passing birthday, and his quiet friendship with Zora became one of the brightest parts of his childhood. Whenever school became overwhelming or memories of his late mother made the mansion feel unusually empty, he found comfort sitting beside her in the library or the greenhouse while she folded fresh linens or arranged flowers. She never treated him like the heir to an influential family. She treated him like a little boy who deserved patience, encouragement, and honesty. Adrian noticed the difference even if he rarely spoke about it. His son smiled more often now. He laughed without hesitation. He asked curious questions about the world instead of hiding inside books. Adrian understood that no amount of wealth or influence could have purchased that kind of healing. It had been earned through simple acts of compassion repeated day after day. Beyond the estate walls, however, another story unfolded in complete silence. Business rivals who had once challenged the Calloway family publicly no longer appeared at formal events or charity galas. Instead, unfamiliar investment groups quietly purchased neighboring properties. Delivery schedules changed without explanation. A few longtime suppliers unexpectedly canceled contracts despite decades of dependable partnerships. Adrian's advisors mentioned these developments during private meetings, but each change seemed small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, however, they formed a pattern that no one fully understood. Zora sensed it before anyone else. Delivery drivers she had known for years suddenly disappeared, replaced by unfamiliar faces who spent too much time studying the estate instead of unloading supplies. Landscapers she had never seen before asked unusual questions about service entrances and employee schedules. Even neighborhood birds seemed disturbed on certain mornings, lifting from the trees all at once before settling again moments later. None of those observations proved anything, yet together they left an uneasy feeling she could not explain. One cool October evening, while locking the greenhouse after sunset, Zora noticed faint tire tracks leading toward an old maintenance road that had not been used in years. She stood quietly beneath the fading light, studying the fresh marks pressed into the damp earth. The tracks disappeared into the surrounding woods instead of returning toward the main highway. A cold breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it a strange stillness that settled deep inside her heart. She looked back toward the warmly lit mansion where Oliver's laughter drifted through an open window, and for reasons she could not fully understand, she whispered to herself, "Something is coming." The uneasy feeling Zora carried home from the greenhouse refused to disappear. Over the next several days, she paid closer attention without allowing anyone to notice. She watched unfamiliar utility trucks pause just a little too long near the outer gates before driving away. She noticed that 2 delivery drivers asked identical questions about the family's evening schedule, even though they worked for different companies. Most people dismissed these moments as ordinary coincidences. But Zora had spent 3 years observing details that others overlooked. Patterns mattered. Small changes often pointed toward something much larger. On the final Friday of October, the Calloway estate prepared for a private family dinner. There were no politicians, no business partners, and no reporters. Only Adrian, Oliver, Eleanor, a handful of trusted employees, and a few close relatives gathered beneath the warm lights of the dining room. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Oliver excitedly described the model train set he hoped to finish before Thanksgiving, while Adrian listened with a quiet smile that rarely appeared during business meetings. Watching them together reminded Zora why she had remained at the estate all these years. This place had become more than a workplace. It had quietly become home. As dessert was being prepared, the lights flickered once before returning to normal. Most people barely reacted, but Zora immediately looked toward the tall windows facing the east gardens. The security lights along the distant fence had gone dark. Seconds later they returned, yet something about the brief interruption made her heartbeat quicken. She excused herself politely and carried an empty serving tray toward the kitchen. Instead of entering immediately, she glanced through the narrow service window overlooking the rear courtyard. Two security officers stood speaking into their radios with unusually serious expressions. One hurried toward the operations building while another checked the electronic gate controls. No alarm sounded. No one panicked. Even so, the comfortable rhythm of the evening had quietly disappeared. Zora remembered the fresh tire tracks near the abandoned maintenance road, the unfamiliar contractors, the strange questions, and the restless silence that had settled over the property for weeks. None of those moments seemed separate anymore. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle she wished did not exist. She found Eleanor organizing dessert plates and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Something does not feel right tonight." Eleanor paused, studying Zora's face. During 3 years of working together, she had never seen fear. Replace the calm confidence that usually defined the young housekeeper. Without asking unnecessary questions, Eleanor nodded once and quietly contacted the head of security, asking him to verify every entrance before the evening ended. Minutes later, Adrian stepped into the hallway after receiving the same quiet update. His expression remained composed, but his instincts had carried him through decades of impossible decisions, and those instincts told him not to ignore unusual patterns. He thanked Eleanor, then turned toward Zora. "You noticed something before anyone else, did you not?" She hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "I cannot explain it, sir. I only know that the estate has not felt the same for several weeks." Adrian looked past her toward the long corridor leading to the family wing, where Oliver's laughter echoed faintly through the open doorway. He placed one hand against the polished banister, thinking carefully before giving a calm instruction. "Until we understand what is happening, Oliver does not leave the house without someone he trusts beside him." Zora quietly nodded. Neither of them realized that the decision made in that peaceful hallway would become the reason the Calloway family still had a future when the longest night of their lives finally arrived. The warning spread quietly through the estate without creating panic. Additional security officers took new positions near the family wing. Exterior gates remained under constant observation, and every employee was instructed to report even the smallest irregularity. To the outside world, nothing appeared different. The mansion still glowed warmly beneath the evening sky, and the long driveway welcomed familiar vehicles with the same quiet elegance it always had. Yet beneath that calm surface, every trusted member of the household sensed that something unseen had begun to move. Zora continued her duties as though nothing had changed, but her attention never drifted far from Oliver. She noticed the way he absent-mindedly looked toward the windows during dinner, perhaps sensing the uneasiness surrounding the adults even if no one spoke about it aloud. After the meal, he carried a history book toward the library, asking if she would help him understand an old map showing hidden railroads across America. She smiled and followed him, grateful for the ordinary conversation. They spent nearly an hour studying faded drawings while rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The peaceful rhythm almost convinced her that her instincts had been wrong. Then every light inside the library dimmed for just a heartbeat before returning. Oliver looked up immediately. "That happened yesterday too," he whispered. Zora turned toward the window. The garden lamps beyond the glass had gone dark again, but this time they remained dark. The estate suddenly felt far too quiet. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no distant conversations from the kitchen, no familiar hum from the fountain outside. It was as though the entire property had paused to listen for something. A radio crackled faintly somewhere beyond the library door, followed by hurried footsteps moving through the corridor. Zora did not wait for an explanation. She remembered every unusual detail from the previous weeks, every unfamiliar face, every strange question, every fresh tire track. Her instincts no longer whispered. They shouted. She knelt beside Oliver and spoke with calm certainty. I need you to trust me exactly the way you trusted me when we built your first wooden city. He searched her face for only a second before nodding. Together, they slipped through a narrow service door hidden behind floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, one she had discovered years earlier while helping maintenance workers repair damaged shelving. The passage connected to an old network of corridors originally built decades earlier for deliveries and emergency access. Few people still remembered they existed. Lantern lights mounted along the stone walls cast a soft amber glow as they walked deeper beneath the mansion. Oliver held tightly to her hand, but never complained. Are we hiding? He asked quietly. Zora chose her words carefully. We are giving your father time to make sure everything is safe. Above them, faint footsteps echoed through the floors, followed by muffled voices that rose and faded before. Silence returned again. She could not make out the words, only the urgency behind them. After several minutes, they reached an old storage chamber beneath the east wing where blankets, bottled water, flashlights, and emergency supplies had been stored years earlier and quietly maintained ever since. Zora helped Oliver sit on a wooden bench before wrapping a warm blanket around his shoulders. The little boy looked up at her with complete confidence, the same confidence he had shown every time she helped him rebuild fallen towers or solve difficult homework. You promised my father you would stay with me, he said softly. Zora smiled despite the growing uncertainty pressing against her heart. And I always keep my promises. Neither of them realized that above their heads Adrian had already discovered Oliver's empty bedroom. And for one terrifying moment, the strongest man in the city believed he had lost the one person he had sworn to protect above all else. Minutes inside the hidden chamber felt like hours. Oliver remained remarkably calm, sitting beside an old wooden table while tracing invisible lines across the faded map he had tucked beneath his arm before leaving the library. Zora stayed near the narrow doorway, listening carefully to every distant sound carried through the aging stone walls. Sometimes she heard hurried footsteps above them. Sometimes only silence answered. The uncertainty weighed heavier than fear because silence left too much room for imagination. Oliver finally looked up. Do you think my father knows where we are? Zora hesitated only long enough to choose hope over doubt. Your father knows that you are brave, and he knows I keep my promises. That will help him find us. The little boy smiled faintly before wrapping the blanket more tightly around his shoulders. Above them, Adrian moved through the mansion with remarkable composure despite the storm inside his heart. Every room had been searched. Every hallway had been cleared. Trusted members of his security team confirmed that the estate itself remained secure, yet Oliver's bedroom stood empty. For the first time in years, Adrian questioned every decision he had made that evening. Then Eleanor quietly approached him carrying a small notebook. Sir, she said softly, there is something you should remember. Adrian looked at her. 3 years ago, when Zora first arrived, she volunteered to help maintenance organize the old service corridors beneath the East Wing. She memorizes places better than anyone I have ever met. Adrian's expression changed instantly. He remembered watching her learn every corner of the estate without ever asking for recognition. What had once seemed like simple dedication suddenly became the answer, standing directly in front of him. Without another word, he walked toward the oldest section of the mansion where a narrow oak cabinet concealed the forgotten entrance to the underground passages. As the heavy wooden door opened, cool air drifted upward carrying the faint scent of stone and cedar. Adrian descended carefully with a flashlight in one hand, calling Oliver's name only once before stopping to listen. At first there was nothing. Then a familiar young voice echoed gently through the corridor. Dad. Adrian followed the sound around one final corner. There, beneath the soft glow of an emergency lantern, sat Oliver with a history book resting on his lap, while Zora remained standing nearby, her shoulders finally relaxing after hours of quiet vigilance. Oliver jumped to his feet and ran straight into his father's arms. Adrian knelt immediately, holding his son with a gratitude too deep for words. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Relief filled the narrow chamber more completely than any conversation ever could. When Adrian finally looked toward Zora, he noticed the exhaustion in her eyes and the dust covering her uniform from hours spent beneath the estate. Yet she stood with the same quiet dignity she had carried since the day she first arrived. "You knew where to take him," Adrian said quietly. Zora nodded. "I remembered every place that could keep him safe." Adrian slowly looked around the forgotten room, realizing that everything she had learned over 3 ordinary years had led to this single extraordinary night. Every hallway she memorized, every hidden passage she cleaned, every forgotten storage room she organized had become part of a promise she never expected to fulfill. He stepped toward her and, without the slightest hesitation, placed one hand gently over hers. 3 years ago, he said softly, "I believed I was protecting one employee who deserved respect. Tonight, I understand the truth. You protected the future of my family before anyone else even knew it needed protecting." Around them, the quiet stone chamber fell completely still, and every person present understood that loyalty had just rewritten the meaning of family. Several months later, the Calloway estate looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The iron gates opened quietly each morning. Gardeners trimmed the rose bushes with patient hands. The marble floors reflected sunlight pouring through tall windows, and the laughter of a growing boy once again echoed through the halls. Yet everyone who lived there understood that the mansion itself had changed forever. The greatest transformation could not be seen in stone, wood, or glass. It lived in the way people greeted one another, in the respect carried through every conversation, and in the quiet understanding that loyalty had become the family's strongest foundation. Adrian Calloway ordered the forgotten service corridors to be restored instead of sealed away. He insisted that every employee learn the history of the estate, not because he expected another emergency, but because he wanted every person working under his roof to know they were trusted with something meaningful. During one meeting with the household staff, Adrian stood before people who had served his family for decades and spoke with the same calm certainty that had silenced an entire ballroom 3 years earlier. "Titles explain responsibility," he said. "They do not measure character. Never mistake one for the other." No one needed to ask whom he meant. Zora Bennett continued wearing the same Navy housekeeping uniform she had always worn. She refused a larger office, declined unnecessary privileges, and insisted on sharing lunch with the kitchen staff, just as she always had. When Eleanor jokingly suggested that she deserved a grand title after everything that had happened, Zora simply smiled. "Respect is enough," she answered. "Everything else is decoration." Oliver, however, ignored every attempt to keep life exactly the same. Whenever teachers at school asked students to write about the person they admired most, he always wrote about Zora. When friends visited the estate, he proudly introduced her before showing them the library or the gardens. On his next birthday, he placed one empty chair beside his own at the family table and refused to begin dinner until she joined them. No one argued. Adrian quietly nodded toward the chair, and the entire family waited with gentle smiles until Zora finally accepted. It became a tradition that lasted for years. As autumn returned once more, Adrian invited employees, relatives, and longtime friends to gather in the East Garden, where a single young oak tree had been planted overlooking the hills. Beside it rested a simple bronze plaque without expensive decorations or elaborate words. It read, "This family stands because loyalty chose courage before recognition." Adrian waited until everyone had fallen silent before speaking. 3 years ago, one person walked through these gates believing she had come here to earn a paycheck. The truth is that she brought something this family did not realize it was missing. She brought the kind of character that cannot be purchased, inherited, or commanded. She reminded us that dignity offered to another person is never wasted. It always returns, often when we need it most. He turned towards Zora, not as an employer addressing an employee, but as one grateful human being speaking to another. "You once told my son that you always keep your promises. Today I make one of my own. As long as I have a home, you will always have one. As long as my family carries the Calloway name, your place among us will never be questioned." The garden remained perfectly still as a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the young oak tree. Oliver reached for Zora's hand while Adrian stood beside them, no longer separated by status or circumstance, but united by gratitude. Some people believe a family's legacy is preserved by wealth, influence, or power. The Calloway family learned a different truth. A legacy survives because someone chooses compassion when no one is watching, loyalty when no reward is guaranteed, and courage when walking away would have been easier. And on that quiet autumn afternoon, everyone present remembered exactly what dignity looked like.